The smell in Sterling's mercantile was always the same, a thick, comforting blend of ground coffee, cured leather, and dust from the floorboards. But that day, in the late autumn of 1883, another scent had been added to the air, mockery. It was sharp and thin, and it was aimed squarely at me. I stood by the counter, my list of winter supplies clutched in a hand stiff from early frost, and pretended not to hear them. I was 67 years old, a widower for 2 of those years, and I had learned that the easiest way to endure foolishness was to act deaf to it. But their voices carried, deliberately pitched across the space between the pickle barrel and the bolt goods. "An ice house," boomed John Sterling, a man whose voice was as round and red as his face. "Abel, the river gives us all the ice we need in winter. What in God's name do you need a house for it for?" Laughter followed, a rough, barking sound from the half-dozen ranchers and farmhands gathered around the pot-belly stove. They saw a man stooped by grief, a lonely old rancher whose mind had finally cracked under the strain of solitude. They saw my plan not as foresight, but as folly. My wife, Marta, had told me stories of the old country, of deep, stone-lined pits packed with river ice and sawdust, where the winter's cull could last through the heat of summer. "Waste is a sin the land does not forgive," she used to say, her hands kneading dough, her voice a low and steady rhythm. After I lost her, her words were all I had left. They were the architecture of my grief, and the blueprint for my survival. I was building a house of ice and sod on the north-facing slope of my property, a half-buried mound that looked, to the unimaginative, like a giant's tomb. They called it Abel's Folly, they called me the Ice King of Nowhere. I folded my list, the paper worn soft as cloth. I could feel Sterling's eyes on me, waiting for a defense, for an argument he could dismantle with a bellow of laughter. I gave him nothing. I simply paid the clerk for my salt, my flour, and the 50 extra yards of canvas I needed. As I turned to leave, Sterling's voice snagged me one last time. "Don't go burying yourself in that thing before the ground freezes solid, old man." More laughter. I paused in the doorway, the cold November air a welcome shock against my face. I didn't turn around. I just spoke into the wind, my voice quiet but clear enough to carry back into the warmth of the store. "You all laugh now," I said. "But a winter will come. A winter will always come. And on that day, you'll learn the difference between a chunk of river ice and a season's worth of meat." I stepped out and pulled the door shut, leaving them to their coffee and their certainty. They saw a fool's errand. I saw a promise. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that a day was coming when they would have to choose between their pride and their hunger. If you've ever held onto an idea that everyone else called crazy, an idea that kept you warm when the world was cold, stick with me. This is what happens when the world finally stops laughing and starts listening. Marta was the one who understood the land's unforgiving memory. She'd grown up somewhere colder, a place of deep winters and short, desperate summers, and she carried its lessons in her bones. "The land remembers," she'd tell me, looking out over our rolling pasture, her eyes seeing more than just grass and cattle. "It remembers drought. It remembers flood. It remembers the blizzard that takes everything and leaves nothing but silence." In our first years on the ranch, that abundance felt eternal. The grass was high, the cattle grew fat, and the winters, while cold, were manageable. We'd slaughter what we needed, salt and smoke what we could, and sell the rest. But there was always waste. In a good year, it was a nuisance. In a lean year, it was a quiet heartbreak. A side of beef that turned just a little too quickly in a warm spell, a ham that the smoke didn't quite take to. Each loss was a small failure, a silent crack in the foundation of our security. When Marta passed, the silence she warned me about descended on my small house. It was a physical presence, as heavy as a winter drift against the door. The ranch became a map of her absence. The empty chair by the hearth. The unused rolling pin on the kitchen counter. The garden, which I tried to tend but which grew wild with a grief of its own. It was in that profound loneliness that her words came back to me, not as memories, but as instructions. "Waste is a sin the land does not forgive." I looked at my herd, my walking fortune, and I saw not just beef and leather, but vulnerability. Every single animal was a gamble against the weather, a bet that the next winter wouldn't be the one she always spoke of. The idea of the ice house started then, a small, stubborn seed in the frozen ground of my sorrow. It wasn't a whim. It was a duty. It was the last promise I could keep to her. I spent weeks with her old leather-bound journal, not the one for accounts, but the one filled with her thoughts, recipes, and sketches of things from her homeland. There, on a brittle, yellowed page, was a rough drawing. A circle dug into the earth, a conical roof of sod, and labels in her language that I couldn't read but understood perfectly: river ice, sawdust, drain. It wasn't an igloo, not really. It was a fortress against heat, a vault made of cold itself. I chose the spot carefully, a north-facing hillock where the winter snows lingered longest into the spring, shaded by a stand of stubborn, wind-bent pines. I started digging. The work was a brutal comfort. The shock of the pickaxe into the dry soil, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel, the ache in my shoulders at the end of the day, it was a physical pain that crowded out the hollow ache in my chest. My neighbors would ride by on their way to town, slowing their horses to watch the old man digging a hole in the ground. They'd shake their heads, a mix of pity and amusement on their faces. They thought grief had unmoored me. In a way, they were right. It had untethered me from their way of thinking, from the easy confidence that tomorrow would be just like today. It had anchored me instead to Marta's wisdom. The hole grew deeper, wider, a perfect circle 12 feet across and 6 feet deep. I lined it with stone I hauled from the creek bed, fitting them together with a slow, patient precision. This was not a grave, as they whispered in town. It was a womb. It was a place where life, in the form of sustenance, would be preserved against the inevitable, unforgiving end. The first real cold of December locked the river in its grip. The water went still and silent, and a skin of ice spread from the banks, thickening by the day until the entire expanse was a solid sheet of grey-green glass. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the start of the true labor. I had the pit dug and lined, the sod roof frame built but not yet covered. Now, I needed the cold itself. I needed to harvest the winter. I owned an old ice saw, a long, wicked-looking thing with a T-shaped handle that my father had used for cutting river blocks for the rail yard's ice boxes. It hadn't been touched in 20 years. I spent an evening sharpening its teeth with a file, the metallic rasp the only sound in my quiet cabin, the lantern light glinting off the newly honed points. The next morning, I hitched my sturdiest mule, old Gideon, to a stone boat, a simple wooden sled for dragging heavy loads. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in my lungs. The sun was a pale, useless wafer in the sky. At the river, I walked out onto the ice, testing its thickness with the butt of my axe. It was over a foot deep, solid and safe. The work was relentless. I'd score a long line with the axe, then begin the slow, arduous process of sawing. It was a two-man job, but I was a one-man operation. I had to put all my weight and strength into each pull, the saw teeth biting into the ice with a deep, groaning shriek. The sound echoed across the frozen valley, a lonely, desperate noise. After an hour of sawing, a long block would finally break free with a sudden, sickening crack and a lurch that nearly threw me into the frigid water. Then came the hauling. Using long-handled ice tongs, I'd wrestle the block, weighing hundreds of pounds, out of the water and onto the stone boat. Gideon, patient and strong, would lean into his harness, and together we'd drag the glistening prize up the bank and across the frozen pasture to the hole on the hill. It was on the third day of this back-breaking toil that I saw a figure watching me from the ridge. It was Finn, an old trapper who lived a few miles up the creek. He was a man of few words and fewer opinions, his face a road-map of hard winters. He didn't ride a fine horse like Sterling, he walked everywhere, silent as a shadow. He watched me for a long time as I fought with a particularly stubborn block of ice. I finally got it onto the sled, my breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. I was exhausted, my arms trembling. As I prepared to lead Gideon away, Finn made his way down the slope. He didn't offer pleasantries. He just looked at the saw, then at me. "That's a widowmaker, using it alone," he said. His voice was gravelly, unused. I just nodded, too tired to speak. He looked at the pit on the hill, then back at the river. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "Cold keeps," he said. Old Truth. He walked over to the other handle of the saw. "Let's see if two old fools are better than one," and just like that, I had an ally. We didn't talk much. We just worked. The rhythm of the saw changed, becoming a steady, powerful conversation between two men who understood the language of labor. The blocks came faster, cleaner. The pile of ice by the pit grew into a small mountain of captured winter, each block a testament to a shared, unspoken understanding. The pile of ice blocks grew into a small, glittering blue mountain beside the pit. Finn and I had harvested enough, I figured, to last 2 summers if packed correctly. He had stayed for a week, working from dawn until the light failed, sharing my simple meals of beans and biscuits in near silence. When the last block was hauled, he simply nodded, took a share of the coffee I offered, and walked away, disappearing back into the folds of the landscape as quietly as he had appeared. He never asked what I was building. He didn't need to. He understood the principle of it, the old truth that the land gives and the land takes, and a wise man prepares for the taking. Now came the assembly. This was the part that earned the most scorn, because it began to take a visible, and to them, ridiculous, shape. I started by laying a thick bed of sawdust on the stone floor of the pit. I'd spent weeks gathering it from the disused sawmill down the valley, hauling it sack by sack. It was my insulation, the barrier between the ice and the warmth of the earth itself. Then, I began to place the ice blocks. It was like masonry, but with a material that fought back, that melted under the touch of my warm hands, that threatened to slip and crush a foot or a leg. I started from the outside edge, building a thick wall, leaving a hollow core. With each layer of ice, I packed sawdust into every crack and crevice, creating a solid, composite wall of ice and wood dust nearly 3 feet thick. It was slow, freezing work. My clothes were perpetually damp. My fingers were numb, clumsy things. But I kept Marta's drawing in my mind's eye. The work became a meditation, a physical prayer. As the walls rose above ground level, I began to build the roof. I'd constructed a frame of thick timbers, forming a low, conical shape. Over this, I laid down a layer of the canvas I'd bought, followed by a thick blanket of prairie sod, cut in squares and fitted tightly together. The final structure was a low, green-brown mound, barely visible from a distance, looking more like a feature of the landscape than a building. A narrow, heavily insulated door faced north. From the outside, it was unremarkable, almost invisible. But inside, it was a cathedral of cold. The ridicule, which had been a low murmur, became a Sunday pastime. Families would ride out after church just to look at Babel's folly if the children would dare each other to touch the sod roof. The men, Sterling chief among them, would make jokes just loud enough for me to hear as I worked. "Heard you're building a new church, Abel," Sterling shouted one afternoon, reining in his expensive horse. "A church of ice? You planning on baptizing the dead?" His companions howled. I didn't look up from the heavy door I was fitting. The door was the most critical part. It was 3 feet thick, a sandwich of wood and packed sawdust, and it had to fit into its frame with an airtight seal. I was planing the edge, my focus absolute. "A man's faith is his own business, John," I said, without stopping my work. "And I have faith in the cold," he snorted, wheeling his horse around. "You have faith in foolishness. When that thing melts in May and floods your field, don't come to me for seed." He rode off, satisfied with his pronouncement. I finished the door, hung it on heavy iron hinges, and fitted it with a simple but strong latch. I stood back and looked at my creation. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't grand. It was a humble, half-buried mound of dirt and ice. But it was finished. It was a promise kept. And it held a core of deep, abiding winter, waiting patiently for the world to need it. Spring arrived late that year, with a reluctant, grudging thaw. The snow receded, leaving behind a sodden, brown landscape. The river, groaning and cracking, finally broke free of its icy prison and ran high and muddy. In town, the talk was of planting and carving. My folly was old news, a winter joke that had lost its punchline. The sod on its roof began to green up, blending it even more seamlessly into the hill. To anyone passing by, it was just a strange lump in the pasture. But I knew what was inside. I knew the cold was still there, trapped and waiting. The time had come for the first real test. It wasn't enough to have built it, I had to know if the principle held. I had to know if Marta's memory was true. I selected a 2-year-old steer from my small herd, one that was healthy but not my prime breeding stock. The act of slaughtering an animal out of season felt profoundly wrong, a violation of the natural rhythm of ranch life. But it was necessary. I did the work myself, cleanly and quickly. I dressed the carcass, splitting it into 2 heavy sides of beef. The air was mild, already hinting at the warmth of summer to come. Flies buzzed, drawn by the scent of blood. This was the enemy: warmth, decay, the relentless process of nature reclaiming its own. I wrapped the 2 sides of beef in clean canvas sheets. Then, with Gideon's help, I dragged them one at a time up the hill to the ice house. Unlatching the heavy door was a moment of truth. I pulled it open, and a wave of air washed over me. It was not the damp, musty smell of a root cellar. It was a clean, sharp, profound cold, the smell of deep winter itself. It was the smell of preservation. Stepping inside was like entering another world, another season. The light from the open door barely penetrated the gloom, glinting off the ice walls, which had fused into a single, solid mass. The temperature difference was staggering. Outside, it was a pleasant spring day. Inside, it was a tomb of cold. My breath plumed in front of me. I hung the 2 sides of beef from heavy hooks I had anchored in the roof beams before covering them. They hung in the center of the chamber, not touching the ice walls. The cold air circulated around them, a silent, invisible guardian. I worked quickly, the chill seeping into my bones. Then, I stepped back out into the warm air, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. I swung the heavy door shut. The latch clicked into place, a sound of finality. And the wait began. Through May and June, I resisted the urge to check on it. I forced myself to walk past the mound without stopping, to treat it as just another part of the hill. But my mind was always on it. Had I packed the sawdust tight enough? Was the door seal perfect? Was there a flaw, a hidden channel for the summer heat to creep in? July brought a wave of oppressive heat. The prairie grass turned brittle and yellow. The creek slowed to a trickle. The cattle stood listlessly in the shade of the few cottonwoods. It was the kind of heat that rots, that spoils, that undoes a man's work. This, I knew, was the true crucible. If the meat could survive this, it could survive anything. The day I chose to open it was the hottest of the year, a blistering afternoon in early August. My hands trembled as I lifted the latch. This was it. The moment of proof, or the moment of failure. I pulled the thick, sawdust-packed door open, and the physics of the thing asserted itself with an audible whoosh. A plume of dense, cold air rolled out of the dark opening and spilled down the grassy slope, chilling my ankles. It smelled of nothing. Not rot, not decay, not the sweet, sickly odor of spoiled meat. It smelled of pure, clean cold. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the evidence wash over me. The absence of smell was the entire point. It was the smell of success. Taking a lantern from the hook where I'd left it, I lit the wick and stepped across the threshold, my boots crunching on the sawdust floor. The transition was jarring. Outside, the world was a blast furnace of heat and shimmering light. Inside, it was a pocket of deep winter, silent and still and profoundly cold. The lantern light pushed back the gloom, revealing the chamber. The ice walls, which I had expected to be slick with meltwater, were bone dry and hard as granite, fused into a seamless, glistening surface. A fine, glittering frost coated the wooden roof beams above me. And there, hanging in the center of the vault, were the 2 sides of beef, exactly as I had left them months before. They were frozen solid, encased in a thin crystalline layer of their own moisture. I reached out a hesitant hand and touched the canvas wrapping. It was stiff and cold as a sheet of iron. I unwrapped a corner of one of the sides. The meat beneath was a deep, healthy red, its fat a clean, pure white. There was no discoloration, no hint of slime, no trace of the decay that would have turned it into a putrid mess in a single hot day outside this chamber. I felt a laugh bubble up from my chest, a raw, incredulous sound that broke the tomb-like silence. It worked. It had actually, impossibly worked. Marta's stories, my grief-fueled labor, the town's mockery, it had all led to this moment of quiet, absolute vindication. I stood there for a long time in the cold dark, the lantern light throwing my long shadow against the wall of ancient ice. This was more than just preserved meat. It was a preserved idea. It was the physical manifestation of an old truth that the modern, confident world had forgotten. It was security. It was a buffer against the whims of nature. It was a fortress of my own making. I cut a small steak from the frozen side, the knife grating against the hard meat. Back in my cabin, I thawed it and cooked it in a hot skillet. It was perfect. The flavor was clean, rich, and untouched by time. As I ate, I looked out the window at the green-brown mound on the hill. It no longer looked like a folly. It looked like the most sensible thing in the entire valley. That night, for the first time in 2 years, I slept a deep and dreamless sleep, the kind of rest that comes only when a long and difficult question has finally been answered. The laughter from the mercantile felt 1,000 miles away, a faint, foolish echo from a world that did not yet understand the cold. But it would. The following autumn, I worked with a renewed sense of purpose. The ice house was no longer an experiment, it was an institution. When the first hard freeze came and the river locked up, I was ready. This time, I didn't need Finn's help, though I sent word to his cabin that he was welcome to a share of whatever the winter provided. My movements were more efficient, my confidence solid. I knew the weight of the blocks, the angle of the saw, the exact mix of ice and sawdust needed for a perfect seal. I wasn't just building a larder for myself anymore. I was stocking a bank. I culled 5 head of cattle from my herd, more than I had ever slaughtered at once. It was a significant portion of my wealth, a bold investment in my own system. I spent a week butchering, wrapping, and hauling, filling the cold, dark chamber of the ice house until it was packed with enough preserved beef to last a family for 2 years. The town watched my procession of activity with a familiar, weary amusement. The joke was old, but they still found ways to freshen it. "Stocking up for the apocalypse, Abel?" Sterling called out as he rode past my fence line one day. I was dragging a heavy quarter of beef on a sled, and I paused to catch my breath. "Just for a long winter, John," I replied, my voice even. "You should try it sometime," he laughed, a big, booming sound that rolled across the pasture. "My cattle are my bank, Abel. They're alive and kicking. I'll take my meat fresh, thank you very much." That was the prevailing wisdom. A man's wealth was in his living herd. To slaughter so many was seen as a sign of poor management, of cashing in your assets at the wrong time. They couldn't see that I wasn't liquidating my assets, I was securing them, transforming them from a fragile, living risk into a stable, preserved certainty. As the winter deepened, something felt different. The cold came earlier and settled in with a more vicious bite than I could remember. The wind had a different voice, a high, keening howl that spoke of vast, empty spaces and unimaginable cold. The animals knew it first. The deer came down from the high country weeks earlier than usual, their coats thick and heavy. The wolves grew bolder, their cries echoing closer to the scattered ranches at night. Even old Gideon, my mule, was restless, pacing in his shed, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind. I sealed the ice house for the winter and banked the foundation of my own small cabin with extra sod and snow. I chopped enough firewood to last me till May and stacked it high against the north wall. A deep, primal instinct, the same one that had guided Marta, told me to prepare. The sky took on a strange, bruised, yellowish tint. The air became unnervously still, the wind dying down to an expectant hush. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, but this felt older, more profound. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. The first flakes began to fall not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, thick curtain, blotting out the landscape in an instant. It was not a normal snow. It was fine and hard, like sand, driven by a rising wind that didn't just blow, but scoured the earth. I stood at my window, watching the world disappear. The laughter from the town, the memory of Sterling's confident face, it all felt like a lifetime ago. The winter martyr had always warned me about, the one the land remembered, had finally arrived. And I was ready. The blizzard was not a storm, it was a siege. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world outside my cabin ceased to exist. There was no sky, no land, only a shrieking, horizontal torrent of white. The wind was a physical force, a malevolent entity that shook the log walls and hammered at the door, seeking any crack, any weakness. The sound was constant, a deafening, soul-crushing roar that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. It was the sound of nature trying to erase everything. I kept the fire stoked, a small, defiant island of warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. The windows were completely plastered over with a thick crust of ice and driven snow, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. I lived by the rhythm of the fire, feeding it logs, watching the flames, listening to the fury outside. My small cabin, which had so often felt empty and lonely, now felt like a fortress, a sanctuary. My thoughts drifted to my neighbors. I pictured Sterling in his large, handsome ranch house, confident and secure. I pictured the other families, the small homesteaders, the farmhands in their drafty bunkhouses. They had firewood, of course. They had provisions for a normal storm. But this was not a normal storm. My greatest concern was for their livestock. The cattle, the sheep, the horses, the living, breathing currency of our entire community. Most ranchers, like Sterling, let their herds roam on open range, believing the animals were hardy enough to find shelter in gullies or stands of trees. They would turn their backs to the wind, huddle together, and endure. But this wind had teeth. This cold was a killer. I thought of my own small herd, the few I hadn't slaughtered, safe in their sturdy, well-banked shed behind the cabin. And I thought of the mound on the hill. Out there, buried under a dozen feet of snow, was my ice house. Inside its frozen walls, my true wealth lay sleeping and secure, untouched by the hurricane of ice and wind. I felt no triumph, no smug satisfaction. Instead, a deep and heavy sadness settled over me. I had been right. My strange, lonely project had been validated in the most terrible way imaginable. But the proof was coming at a devastating cost. On the 4th day, I woke to a profound and unnerving silence. The wind had stopped. The roaring was gone, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt like the world had died. I had to force my door open against a massive drift that had buried the entire front of the cabin. When I finally squeezed through a narrow opening, the sight that greeted me took my breath away. The world was remade. It was a landscape of impossible, alien beauty and utter desolation. Every fence line, every dip and rise of the prairie, was gone, buried under a smooth, undulating sea of white. The snow was packed as hard as stone, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes, waves, and crests. The sun was out, dazzlingly bright, its light reflecting off the endless expanse of white with a painful, blinding intensity. The air was still and lethally cold. I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach clench, what I would find when I could finally travel. The silence wasn't peace. It was the silence of the grave. The winter had come, and it had taken everything. It took another 2 days for the sun to melt and harden the top layer of snow enough to walk on without sinking. I put on my snowshoes and made my way out, not toward town, but toward Sterling's ranch. His property bordered mine to the east, and I needed to see. The silence was absolute. No birds, no coyotes, nothing. The only sound was the crunch of my snowshoes on the hard crust of the snow. I found his herd less than a mile from his house, in a shallow depression where they had tried to seek shelter. It was a scene of utter devastation. They were frozen statues, a solid, unmoving mass of cattle, their heads bowed, their coats thick with ice. They had huddled together for warmth, and had died as one. Hundreds of them. Sterling's entire fortune, his living bank, was gone, turned into a silent, frozen monument to his own certainty. I didn't go any closer. There was a grim privacy to the scene that felt wrong to intrude upon. I turned back, a cold dread spreading through me. If this had happened to Sterling's herd, the largest and hardiest in the valley, it had happened to everyone. My first visitor arrived a week later. It wasn't Sterling. It was a young homesteader named Miller, his face gaunt and chapped raw by the wind. He stood at my door, his hat in his hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Abel," he began, his voice cracking. We lost everything. All the stock. We ate what was in the house, but it's gone now. My wife, the kids." He didn't have to finish. I nodded and gestured for him to come inside. I gave him a hot cup of coffee and a biscuit, which he devoured like a starving animal. I heard the stories, he mumbled, staring into his empty cup. "About your ice house." We all laughed. "I'm sorry for it. But is it true? Do you have food?" "I have meat," I said quietly. I went to the ice house, the path now cleared, and used a heavy pry bar to break the seal of ice that had formed around the door. I brought back a large, frozen roast and a slab of beef ribs. I handed the heavy bundle to him. He stared at it, then at me, his eyes filling with tears. "What do I owe you?" he whispered. "Your family can't eat pride, son," I said. "And they can't eat money. There's no charge. Just feed your children." He left without another word, his shoulders shaking. He was the first. The next day, 2 more families came. Then 3. The news spread through the shattered, starving community, not on the wind, but through whispers of desperation and hope. They came to my door, the same people who had pointed and laughed, and they stood where Miller had stood, their pride stripped away, their faces etched with hunger and loss. I gave to them all. I cut the frozen sides of beef into roasts, steaks, and ribs, and I handed out the canvas-wrapped parcels. Each time, they asked the same question, "What do we owe you?" And each time, I gave them the same answer. It wasn't until the end of the second week that John Sterling finally appeared. He didn't come alone. He came with his wife and his 2 thin-faced sons, all of them looking diminished, their fine clothes hanging loosely on their frames. He stood on my doorstep, the big, confident man reduced to a shadow, his eyes fixed on the worn wood of my porch. "Abel," he said, his voice a low rumble, stripped of its usual boom. "They say you have food, I have meat," I said, my voice flat. I didn't invite him in. I just stood there in the doorway, letting the cold air wash between us. This was the moment. The culmination of a year of ridicule, of a lifetime of different philosophies. Revenge would have been easy. A sharp word, a reminder of his mockery, a price named not in dollars but in humiliation. I could have made him beg. I looked past him at his wife, her face pale and worried, and at his sons, who were just boys, shivering in the cold. I thought of Marta. Waste is a sin the land does not forgive. And what was vengeance but another kind of waste? A waste of spirit. "The price," I said, my voice hard but not cruel, "is that you will come to my door and ask for it. And you've done that. Wait here." I went to the ice house and returned with the largest parcel of meat I had yet given out. I pushed it into his hands. He flinched at its weight and its coldness. "Thank you, Abel," he whispered, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were filled not with gratitude, but with the shattering recognition of his own failure. "There's one more price, John," I said, my voice softening just a little. "When your family eats tonight, you will tell them that they are eating the harvest of a fool's errand." He nodded, a single, jerky motion. He turned and walked away, his family trailing behind him, a king without a kingdom, carrying a frozen piece of a future he had been too proud to imagine. The ice house became the heart of the valley. Through the rest of that long, brutal winter, it was the larder that kept the community from starving. My solitary folly became a public trust. The dynamic of our small world had been completely inverted. The path to my door, once untrodden, was now a packed, well-worn trail. The men who had laughed at me now came to me for sustenance, their gazes lowered, their voices quiet. I never turned anyone away. I established a system. Each family was allotted a share based on their need. There was no money exchanged. The currency was survival. The reversal was complete, but it brought me no joy. Seeing my neighbors, men I had known my entire life, stripped of their pride and forced to accept charity was a heavy burden. I had won the argument, but the victory felt hollow, etched with the communal tragedy of our loss. John Sterling became a different man. The boom in his voice was gone, replaced by a quiet gravity. He organized the other men. They helped me clear the snow, tend to my remaining livestock, and manage the distribution of the meat. They worked with a silent, dogged determination, their labor a form of penance. They were rebuilding the community not with money or new stock, but with shared work and humbled pride. As spring finally broke, the true scale of the devastation was laid bare. The valley was a graveyard of livestock. The economy, our entire way of life, had been wiped out. But we were alive. And we were, for the first time, a true community. We pooled what little resources we had left. The few surviving animals were shared. Seeds were divided. The men, led by Sterling, began the grim task of clearing the frozen carcasses, a long and brutal job that lasted for weeks. That summer, my ice house was empty for the first time. Its purpose had been served. But everyone knew another winter was coming. That autumn, the harvest of ice from the river was not a solitary act. It was a community project. Every able-bodied man was there, working the saws, hauling the blocks, their movements synchronized and efficient. Sterling worked alongside me, his hands as raw and chapped as mine. We filled the ice house to its roof, and then we helped 2 other families build their own, using my design as the blueprint. We were building a shared future, a collective insurance policy against the land's unforgiving memory. Years passed. The valley slowly recovered. New herds were started from stock bought from distant counties. The ranches were rebuilt. But the memory of that winter, the Great White Death as it came to be called, was burned into our collective soul. The ice houses, now a common sight on the north slopes of every ranch, were more than just larders. They were monuments to our fragility and our resilience. They were a testament to the fact that the craziest idea can become the most necessary truth. I lived out my days on that ranch, a quiet patriarch in a community I had inadvertently saved. They no longer called me the Ice King of Nowhere. They just called me Abel. And it was enough. Marta was right. The land remembers. But so do people. They remember mockery, and they remember kindness. They remember who laughed in the sun, and who shared their food in the storm. And you have to ask yourself, when you look at the world, what are you building? Are you building something for the easy days, something that shines in the sun and earns the applause of the crowd? Or are you building for the long winter? Are you digging your foundations deep, preparing for the storm that others refuse to see? Because the winter always comes. It comes for all of us. The question is, what will you have stored away when it arrives?